Did you ever think that getting rid of the baggage you're carrying around might actually take a miracle? A God-type miracle, not the self-help kind. In the past few weeks, we've been looking at several of Jesus' miracles. Miracles meaning things that Jesus did that only God can do. Not only improbable things, but impossible things. Things like healing the unhealable, controlling the uncontrollable, taking something really, really small and using it to provide for a need that was really, really big. That's God-sized stuff. Miracles that show that Jesus is God, and miracles that show that Jesus is coming to heal the brokenness in the world. Because Jesus is a God who cares. Jesus is a God who has compassion for us. Jesus is a God who cares and has compassion for the stuff that we're going through and the baggage that we're carrying around because of it. We also talked about how Jesus is the same God today as he was back then, which means that if Jesus could deal with all the big stuff that Bible people went through, he can also deal with the big stuff that you're going through in your life today. Stuff that brings you all the stress and anxiety. And speaking of stress and anxiety, I mean, have you ever thought of all the healing that needs to happen inside as well as outside? All the emotional stuff, the baggage that goes along with the big stuff that you're dealing with too, all that brokenness that you're trying to let other people know, not let them know it's there, but it is. I mean, you might put a good face on things, even smile now and then, and when people ask you how you're doing, you say, okay. But you're really not. You're really not. Inside, you're crushed by the weight of that you're carrying, and you're stressed. You're suffering. You're suffering, and sometimes almost broken from the emotional toll that all those brokenness in your bodies, in our relationships, storms in your life, obvious lack of something that you need. When that's going on, you also feel fear, anxiety, stress, pain, shame, despair, defeat, hopelessness. I mean, you even have a lot of questions about God and if he's ever going to come and show up to help. And very few people see that baggage that we're carrying around, or how heavy it is. And how much it weighs us down. Well, Jesus does. Jesus does, and Jesus gets that we're going through all that. And Jesus gets our need for healing there too. He gets our need to get rid of all that baggage, and our need for hope when we're feeling pretty hopeless about everything that's going on. So let's look at today's story. Two stories, actually, from that perspective. It's in Mark chapter 5, beginning at verse 21.
Jesus again crossed to the other side of the Sea of Galilee in a boat. A large crowd gathered around him by the seashore. A synagogue leader named Jairus also arrived. When he saw Jesus, he quickly bowed down in front of him. He begged Jesus, "My little daughter is dying. Come lay your hands on her so that she may get well and live." Jesus went with the man. A huge crowd followed Jesus and pressed him on every side.
In the crowd was a woman who had been suffering from chronic bleeding for 12 years. Although she had been under the care of many doctors and had spent all her money, she had not been helped at all. Actually, she had become worse. Since she had heard about Jesus, she came from behind in the crowd and touched his clothes. She said, "If I can just touch his clothes, I'll get well." Her bleeding stopped immediately. She felt cured from her illness. At that moment, Jesus felt power had gone out of him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" His disciples said to him, "How can you ask, 'Who touched me?' when you see the crowd pressing you on all sides?" But he kept looking around to see the woman who had done this. The woman trembled with fear. She knew what had happened to her, So she quickly bowed in front of him and told him the whole truth. Jesus told her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Be cured from your illness."
While Jesus was still speaking to her, some people came from the synagogue leader's home. They told the synagogue leader, "Your daughter has died. Why bother the teacher anymore?" When Jesus overheard what they said, he told the synagogue leader, "Don't be afraid. Just believe." Jesus allowed no one to go with him except Peter and the two brothers, James and John. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a noisy crowd there. People were crying and sobbing loudly. When he came into the house, he asked them, "Why are you making so much noise and crying? The child isn't dead, she's just sleeping." They laughed at him. So he made all of them go outside. Then he took the child's father, mother, and his 3 disciples and went to the child. Jesus took the child's hand and said to her, "Talitha koum," which means, "Little girl, I'm telling you to get up." The girl got up at once and started to walk. She was 12 years old. They were astonished. Jesus ordered them not to let anyone know about this. He also told them to give the little girl something to eat.
So let's take a minute to focus on Jairus' emotions here. I mean, his little girl is dying. And it seems there's nothing he can do about it. I mean, and there is no more helpless or devastating feeling for a parent, is there? I mean, to see your child suffer, and it seems like there's nothing you're able to do about it. To go to all the experts, and their efforts seem to be useless. To even think about burying your kids when your kids are supposed to be ones who are burying you. I mean, fear, helplessness, desperation, despair, hopelessness, it's all there in the mix, isn't it? So how do you deal with that? I mean, the truth is a lot of people don't. A lot of people just carry it around until it breaks them. And that's not a really good option. And perhaps Jairus senses that. So Jairus, this synagogue ruler, tries something different. Jairus went to Jesus. Okay, Jairus went to Jesus even though in the religious circles that he ran in, Jesus wasn't all that popular at this point. And going to Jesus actually involves some personal and professional risk for him because the higher-ups who didn't approve of Jesus at all could have censured him for that. But Jairus didn't care. I mean, he's got a sick kid, a dying kid, and Jairus is going to do whatever it takes to help. Now, Jairus has at least heard rumors of Jesus doing amazing things. And he believes that Jesus could do something that others could not. And so, again, Jairus goes to Jesus. And even though Jairus is one of the more important people in the town, he doesn't talk about his power. He doesn't talk about his prestige or even his record of doing good things as a reason for Jesus to answer his request. Jairus he humbles himself and literally throws himself at Jesus' feet and asks for help. And Jesus says, "I'll come." Just like that. And for the first time in a while, Jairus has a little hope. Maybe not a lot, but a little. And a little hope can go a long way. And before we go on in this conversation, let's make a few connections with what's going on in your life right now. Go ahead and hit pause and stop and think about this. Where do you need hope in your life right now? Where do you need hope in your life right now? Think about that, and then before you hit play again to go on in this conversation, ask Jesus for help. Okay, like Jairus, you went to Jesus looking for help and for hope, and because Jesus says, "I'll come," you're thinking that, okay, finally things are going to get better before they get worse. But then there's this strange interruption on the way to the miracle that leaves you sort of scratching your head. Let me get back into what Mark wrote again. It's in verse 25. In the crowd was a woman who had been suffering from chronic bleeding for 12 years. Although she had been under the care of many doctors and had spent all her money, she had not been helped at all. Actually, she had become worse. Since she had heard about Jesus, she came from behind in the crowd and touched his clothes. She said, "If I can just touch his clothes, I'll get well." Her bleeding stopped immediately. She felt cured from her illness. A little background on that. Because of the Jewish purity laws, this woman shouldn't have been in the crowd at all. And she shouldn't have touched Jesus' robe either. That was a big no-no. And she'd been suffering for a long time. It's now 12 years and counting. This woman's in tough shape. All right, nobody could help her. And because of those purity laws, most people tended to avoid her, wanting as little contact with this woman as possible. So she's not just dealing with physical wounds here, is she? She's got this emotional baggage that she's carrying around. So fear and shame and despair and discouragement, and then add in a feeling of worthlessness as others keep wanting little or nothing to do with her. And a feeling of helplessness and hopelessness as this has been going on for 12 years and no one at all has been able to help her. And in fact, she was made worse in the process and bankrupted along the way. And all that emotional baggage, right? Just think about it as like the crushing weight of her brokenness. It's probably all there. This woman had probably given up thinking that there was any human help for her. And then Jesus comes to town. And like Jairus, she'd apparently at least heard rumors of some of the things that Jesus had done or could do. And though she felt unworthy to touch this holy man, she'd been hurting and suffering for such a long time that she believed that Jesus could heal. And so even though society had rammed home that message, you're unworthy, you can't touch this man, her faith made her reach out to Jesus and touch him anyway. And Jesus healed her, like immediately. But Jesus also came, remember, to heal the inside stuff. All that emotional and spiritual baggage that we're carrying around. And that's why Jesus actually takes time to seek this woman out and to talk to her, even when it appears there's no time for that because he's got to get to Jairus' house. Let me continue with what Mark wrote here. Verse 30, he turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" His disciples said to him, "How can you ask who touched me when you see this crowd pressing on you on all sides?" But he kept looking around to see the woman who had done this. The woman trembled with fear. She knew what had happened to her, so she quickly bowed in front of him and told him the whole truth. Jesus told her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace, be cured from your illness." Now, and as you're reading that, it just seems strange, right? Because Jesus knew who touched him and who healed her and how she was healed, because he's God, right? So why take the time to seek her out? When time is so urgent that he's got to get to Jairus' house. Well, it's for the woman's benefit, actually. You see, she almost certainly touched his robe out of superstition. Because people in the day kind of thought that a person's power, their aura, if you will, kind of extended to their clothes. And so the superstition was that was why she would get healing from Jesus. And if Jesus had just walked on and healed her and not talked to her, that thought would have been reinforced in her mind, that she was healed through magic. And Jesus wanted this event to actually draw her to faith. He wanted this event to draw her to faith in him, so Jesus takes the time to do that. But as you read on in the story, it appears that the timing here is all off. Because when you read the next part of Mark's report, what you find is it appears that this miracle comes at the cost of another one. Now again, let's make some connections before we move on to that part of the story. Hit pause and think about this. When has God's timing not made much sense to you? Go ahead and hit pause and think about that right now. Okay, back to Jairus. Now, stopping to talk to this woman meant that Jesus didn't get to Jairus' house on time, or so it seemed. Jesus is standing there still talking to that woman, and Jairus gets the word, verse 35, your daughter has died. And Jairus' emotions at this point, grief, anguish, unfathomable pain, certainly that's going on. I mean, death does that to you. Oh, maybe a little bit of guilt and shame. That no matter what I did, it wasn't enough to save my little girl. I mean, you can tell your mind can tell your heart all these reasons, and that you did everything humanly possible, but the heart doesn't really listen to that at a time like this, does it? And then maybe there's this whole defeat and despair and hopelessness, because there's no coming back from death, is there? And maybe even a few why God questions, and maybe some anger with God at God thrown into boot. So how do you carry all that around? You don't. You can't. The weight, the burden of all that is too much for you, isn't it? But it's not too much for Jesus. It'll break you, but it won't break Jesus. And I think that's one reason that another one of Jesus' friends, Matthew, remembered something Jesus said and wrote it down so that we could read it and remember it too. Matthew chapter 11, verse 28. Jesus says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." You see, Jesus knows how heavy your burdens are. Jesus knows that the weight of the burden is sometimes way more than you can bear. Jesus knows that weight is sometimes so big that it's like you can't even move. You're just broken and broken down. And stuck where you are, and unable to help yourself, unable to heal yourself, unable to find hope, unable to move forward, which I think that's where Jairus is at this moment. And Jesus gets that. All right, Jesus knows, Jesus understands, and Jesus has compassion. So Jesus knows that Jairus can't move, so what does Jesus do? He moves. Jesus is the one who initiates the action, who makes the first move here, who takes the step that helps Jairus move in the right direction. There's grace again. God reaching out to us first. And so Jesus says to Jairus, as he's stuck there with all that emotion and burden weighing him down, let's go to your house anyway. Let's you and me keep going the way that we were going. You and me together. I can help. I really can. I mean, all hope seems lost. And Jesus still holds out hope. See, this is Jesus. And Jesus wants us to see that with him, there is always hope. There is always room for another miracle. And it's never, ever too late for Jesus to help. And so what Jesus does here is he holds out hope first, this is important, with a word. Let me read it to you. Verse 36, when Jesus overheard what they said, he told the synagogue leader, "Don't be afraid, just believe." Don't be afraid, just believe. A word is the first part of the miracle. The first part of the healing. The first part of letting go of the baggage, the first thing to give hope, even in the spot of almost total hopelessness, a word from someone who's proven trustworthy and reliable, that gives you something to hold on to while you wait for Jesus to do what only Jesus can do. You know, that's still the way Jesus operates today. First, a word. A word from one who cares, spoken to those broken and hurting places in our hearts. First that word, and then the other miracles. Miracles that leave no doubt that Jesus is a God who can and that he's a God who cares. Listen to what happens at the end of this story, verse 41. Jesus took the child's hand and said to her, Talitha koum, which means, little girl, I'm telling you to get up. The girl got up at once and started to walk.
All right, real quick. Here are 4 unrelated stories, all with a common bond. First, let's go back to November 20th, 1982. For the 85th time, Cal and Stanford are involved in a heated contest. After a wild game, Stanford, led by young John Elway, takes the lead with just 4 seconds left. The Stanford fans and band are already celebrating, and why shouldn't they? The game is over. One final play begins as Stanford kicks short to Cal. A mad scramble ensues. Laterals follow near tackles, then a blind over-the-shoulder lateral. A mad race to the end zone. Down goes the Stanford trombonist as the touchdown is scored. The unthinkable happens and Cal wins. As it turns out, it wasn't over. How about this one? Meet the Lilies, Russell and Terry. It's 2001. Their 10-year marriage has been a constant source of frustration. A vicious cycle of selfishness, fighting, and isolation has left them both exhausted, angry, and done. Never mind the vows. Never mind the 2 young boys. This one is beyond hope. This marriage is over. Following their divorce, Russell becomes a follower of Christ, and Terry begins to notice the transformation taking place in Russell. Hardened hearts soften. The relationship begins to heal. Forgiveness is sought and granted. In 2007, they remarry. The one that became 2 is now 1 again. Then there's Raylene Kuferschmidt. It's January 2008. Ray suffers a cerebral hemorrhage. Declaring her brain dead, the doctors remove her breathing tubes. Knowing that it's over, the hospital releases Ray to her family so she can be taken home to die comfortably. Meanwhile, Ray's family plans her funeral. But someone forgot to tell Ray that it was over. At home, Ray suddenly wakes up. She's checked again by her doctors, who cannot believe that she's still alive, much less alert and healthy. Funeral plans have now turned into vacation plans for Ray and her family. Logically devoid of hope, legally divorced, literally dead. Everyone thought it was over. It's not the first time. Flashback almost 2,000 years. A man claiming to be the long-anticipated Messiah is unfairly accused. Offered up to the lying crowds by a Roman official, the supposed Savior is flogged, mocked, tortured, and beaten. He is nailed to a tree and crucified. He dies and is buried. Hopes that he is the Messiah fade away. It is finished. Friends scatter. Disciples hide. Evil celebrates. And for 3 days, it is over. But on the 3rd day, there's an empty grave. Evil has lost its victory. Death has lost its sting. Suddenly, miraculously, the only thing that is now over is hopelessness. 4 stories, 1 message. It's not over, even when it's over.
I think there's a few things we can really learn from these 2 stories in Mark that help us when we're dealing with that big stuff, the heart stuff, that emotional and spiritual stuff that nobody else can see, but that really weighs us down. I mean, with Jesus, it's not over. It's never over. even when things seem impossible and all hope appears to be lost. I mean, there's no comeback from death until Jesus did it and raised this girl from the dead. So when life stuff or heart stuff is weighing you down, I mean, learn from Jairus and this woman here. Number one, ask Jesus for help, like Jairus and the woman did, even if the issue seems unfixable. However improbable, there is nothing that's impossible for Jesus to do. Number two, trust Jesus' word, even if you don't see how it could be, because Jesus' word always comes true in the end. Number three, trust Jesus' timing. Even if you don't understand his timing, trust his timing. Because Jesus' timing always ends up fitting in God's perfect plan. And then number four, trust Jesus' track record. Trust his track record even if what you see doesn't seem to make sense. Because Jesus, well, he's the same God yesterday, today, and forever, right? Which means that even when the burden is really big and the weight you carry is too much and all hope seems lost, it's not. It is never too late for Jesus. Never. I mean, fear, stress, anxiety, pain, shame, despair, depression, defeat, hopelessness, sometimes that stuff really weighs you down, doesn't it? Sometimes it seems like it has such a stranglehold on you that you just can't escape. But remember, Jesus knows where you are. And Jesus knows what you're going through. And Jesus is on his way to help even before you ask. Remember, Jesus, in these stories, was willing to touch the unclean stuff that no one else is willing to touch in order to help make people whole again. Not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. And not only did Jesus walk into those unclean spaces that nobody wanted to go in order to bring hope and healing where people needed it most, Jesus, who is the holy God, he actually became unclean for us. Jesus took on our sin and our shame and all our emotional, spiritual baggage on himself, and he carried it to a cross. And then in one selfless act, Jesus willingly died on that cross so all that stuff could be put to death, and so that people could be made whole again, forgiven, wounds healed. The ones people can see and the ones they can't. Maybe even the ones you're trying to hide from yourself. And then to prove that that was all true, Jesus himself rose from the dead. He rose from the dead, showing that he had conquered the stronghold of sin by the power of his grace. And that actually happened. I mean, there are lots of eyewitnesses who saw Jesus die and who saw him alive again. And Jesus invites you to believe that that's true. To believe that that's true, and to believe that because Jesus lives, that you have a new chance at life too. Looking for miracles today? When you look at these miracles, it helps you remember that no matter what you're facing, it is never too late for Jesus. Jesus knows what you're going through right now. And Jesus is on his way to help, on his way to heal, on his way to deal with your impossible stuff, even the hard stuff, all that emotional and spiritual baggage that's weighing you down. On his way to help you deal with all your issues and to give you hope. I mean, that's who Jesus is. That's how much Jesus loves, and that's how much he gets us. And when you see that about Jesus, that's when fear starts to hide. And that's when shame starts to kind of slink away and hope starts to rise. And your joy begins to come back. Maybe not completely, maybe not all at once, especially if your stuff is still there, but joy's rising and it's building. It might even be building up into sort of a crescendo. Do you need that? I know I do. So seek Jesus out. Believe that it's true. Believe that he's here. Believe that it's never too late for Jesus. Believe that Jesus is on his way to help and to heal and to help you live again.